I am really excited to be leading up this conversation, picking up really on themes that we started yesterday and got repeated again this morning around homeownership and housing as the largest asset that most of our families own in their lifetime, really. My name is Janice Babbler. I oversee the economic policy work at National Council of La Raza, a Hispanic civil rights organization that probably most of you are familiar with. So it's hard to even start talking about housing and homeownership without acknowledging what we've just been through and are continuing to go through, which is really the foreclosure crisis of a lifetime. We are still reeling from the greatest recession since the Great Depression, and I don't have to tell anybody in this room that really our communities have borne the brunt of those effects: persistent double-digit unemployment rates, foreclosure rates far and above other communities. And so that experience has left a lot of people really questioning the role, maybe even the value of homeownership. And I think even in this room, amongst friends, I mean, this is really like family, amongst family, I mean, I think we're really grappling with what's the right amount of homeownership? What role should this play in our communities? We've seen it go so poorly. What does that mean for us as a community? And we've seen these attacks that also come from external folks who have done everything from blame the entire crisis on policies that tried to equalize homeownership rates, to accusations that we've over-focused on homeownership at the expense of rental. There's probably at least a little bit of truth there. And then there's this underlying narrative around families that just can't manage their money. We've kind of talked about that over the last day and a half as well. But we hear this kind of creep up even amongst our friends. I would point to the president, whose own narrative on this issue refers to responsible homeowners and wanting to help responsible homeowners, as opposed to all of those irresponsible homeowners who got into a big conspiracy and decided to try to put banks out of business by demanding subprime loans and then defaulting on them. This was their grand plan, right? No, of course it wasn't. But we see that responsible language kind of creep in, even amongst those elected officials that are supposed to be our champions and are supposed to be our friends. So the ramifications are, again, we all know what they were. We lost a lot of wealth in the recession, and in particular due to the foreclosure crisis. But I want to posit for this group that is not a reason for us to walk away from homeownership, either as an asset or as a public policy goal. And there's two reasons that I'm going to put out there for you on why that's the case. The first is not something that I would shy away from necessarily, but Jim, earlier you were looking for what are our three main messages. This isn't it. But again, since we're amongst family, I'm going to say this, which is that homeownership is our modern day land ownership. And for those of us who are thinking about closing the racial wealth gap, and we're thinking about these things from a justice lens, I think that it's imperative that we keep in mind that owning that home is more than the sticks and bricks. Sure, it is a financial asset, and that's a critical role that it plays. But it's also access to so many other things that are critical to our families. And homeownership and land ownership is still a source of power in this country. It still sort of puts you in that body politic in a different way. And I don't think that we as advocates for racial justice should lose sight of that important goal. Now, again, those aren't the talking points I would use outside this room. I would use these sets of talking points. My second issue, which is that this is, at its bones, an economic issue. Communities of color are driving household formation. You're simply not going to have a functioning housing market if it doesn't include and reflect the experiences of families of color. We weren't starting from the same place. We're even further behind. So this system that we're about to rebuild, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that, has to reflect the needs of communities of color. By 2020, half of all first-time homebuyers will be Latino. If they can't get financing, who's going to buy the boomer houses when they go to retire, when they want to scale back? Our market will shrink unless we're a major part of it. Housing is, therefore, it is both a financial asset. That's one of the reasons why we pursue it. It's also a social and civic asset. It is part of our community and our fabric. Now, I want to say, again, that's not to the exclusion of those of us that are renters. I'm currently renting. And a balanced housing policy is critical to making homeownership possible. So I don't want to leave that out. And in fact, over the course of their lifetime, most people are either or. Most people rent at some point in their life. So I don't want to leave that out. But because this is about closing the racial wealth gap, and because we've been having such a robust conversation about broadening our definition of assets and around racial justice, I wanted to put those frames out there. So we in this room, like I said, we might be motivated by some of those moral issues, but when it comes down to it, this is really an economic issue, which brings us to our system of today, which is really broken and falling apart at the seams. Franny, as I like to call them, or Fannie and Freddie, and FHA are financing the vast majority of loans in this, of mortgages in this country, both purchase and refinance. And that's really an untenable situation for a variety of reasons that I won't go into now. But suffice to say that as we move into 2013, one of the major policy conversations on the table is going to be what to do with those entities, those government-sponsored agencies, how to wind them down, and what replaces them. And the thing that replaces them will be the mortgage infrastructure that will serve our families for generations. That infrastructure will determine the volume, the scope, the cost of capital that flows to our communities and the methods by which it flows into communities or does not flow to certain communities. And that's certainly been a big part of our story, right? That fair and affordable forms of credit have simply not been available in the same way to our communities. Now is a real opportunity. If we're able to shape this new infrastructure at the outset, then we will have a real shot at building a fair and inclusive mortgage market. Housing is by no means a silver bullet, and it exists within the context of all of the things that we're talking about. But for now, for this panel, for today, we're going to really zero in on homeownership. We're going to zero in on how do we move from this, this place where we are, which is still reeling from foreclosures, to a purchase and sort of more of an opportunity-driven strategy. So with me to help us unpack the strategies, the obstacles, the challenges, we've got some great panelists. I'm not going to read their full bios, which you have in your book, but I would like to welcome Angelique Campbell, Supervisory Policy Analyst in the Division of Consumer and Community Affairs at the Federal Reserve Board, Araceli Panameño, Director of Latino Affairs at the Center for Responsible Lending, and Leslie Wheelock, Director of Economic Policy at National Congress of American Indians.
Good afternoon. My name is Leslie Wheelock. I'm the Director of Economic Policy at the National Congress of the American Indians. National Congress of American Indians is the largest and most representative organization of Native governments in the United States. We were started in 1944 to address the termination policies of the United States government, which at the time was terminating Indian tribes. I wanted to tell you a little bit more about Native housing, because when we talk about housing for Native people, we actually are walking in two worlds. We're walking in the world of the tribal lands and the tribal housing and tribal housing policies, and we're walking in the lands of the urban environment. Our people move back and forth between those two lands with some regularity, depending a lot on the economy, education, jobs, and as a result, we have a saying that we're always going home. We're always going back to our people, we're always going back to our communities, and we're always going back to our home families and our homes. So one of the things that I wanted to focus on a bit is how Native housing is different and how it is the same. When we talk about the urban environment, the housing situations for Native people in the urban environment are very much like the housing situations for other minorities in the urban environment. I wanted to give you a little bit of insight into the housing situations on the reservations. Our reservation stock is typically on a combination of trust land and fee land. The fee land looks like a piece of land. You buy the piece of land with the property. You take control of it. It may be overall controlled by the tribe itself if it's on the reservation, but you as an individual homeowner can own the property and the land unless the tribe has a special property program set up for you to do that as a tribal member. When you're on trust land, you can buy or acquire the house, often from the tribe, but sometimes from the individual owner. The land itself, however, like all native land, up until recently, that transfer of land from owner to owner has to be approved by the Secretary of the Interior, according to law. What that means is that land transfers for many tribes, not for all tribes these days, but for many tribes, are slow and very difficult. And one of the results, possibly one of the benefits of that, is that the tribes themselves own a lot of the housing stock. The tribes themselves have block grant programs that allow them to create the housing that their populations need. And the tribes themselves have ownership policies and programs set up for their tribal members. However, what that also means is one of two things, and often kind of a mixed bag of things. But I'll look at two different cases. In one case, you have a tribal borrower, a member of a tribe borrowing from their tribe, and you have tribe lending to, in a sense, giving a fee to the tribal member to live in the house. And so there's a payment for living in the house, not quite rent, not quite a mortgage, but the person living in the house doesn't really build any true equity in the house. On the other extreme of that, you have the tribal member going out to get a loan for that house when the house doesn't sit on land that can be collateralized. The house might be collateralized, but as you can tell, the transfer of the land underneath it is difficult. And so the tribal owner wanting to get a loan has typically to pay higher fees, higher interest rates, and so forth. But I wanted to take you into a little bit of how things are similar. We are working with mostly our tribal children in terms of financial literacy, bringing their literacy skills up to and above and beyond, from what I can tell, public housing financial literacy that's being taught, public school financial literacy that's being taught in Washington, D.C. And what I wanted to do in particular was to talk about a little bit about, I skipped over something, so I need to backtrack here for a second. I wanted to refocus on the points of recovery, stability, and security. Those points for Native people have kind of an interesting twist. When we talk about recovery, we talk in terms of self-determination and the recovery of our self-determination and our ability to control our own land and to control our own finances and to control our own futures. When we talk about stability, we're talking about, for a lot of us, stability of the laws and regulations that affect our citizens. A lot of those laws and regulations come from the federal government. They change often. And as a result of that, our situation is very shaky in times. We don't know if we can go out and plan a business because we don't know what the policy is going to be. We don't know if we can plan a school because we don't know what the policy is going to be. If we go out and we plan an education stream for our kids, are we going to be able to maintain that, or is the policy going to change? Similar to what a lot of schools found in the No Child Left Behind program, Native schools find in a lot of different policy changes that run across the board for our schools, for our people, for our economies. What we're looking to achieve in terms of security is something that will allow or enable Native nations and their citizens to develop their communities, their education, their social systems, and their economies. And now, how are we the same? One of the ways that I mentioned earlier is that we're always going home. We talked about migration earlier today. Our people had a tendency to migrate from east to west rather than from south to north as we were pushed in that direction. I mentioned to another member of NCAI here today that as a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, We may have been one of the few tribes that moved voluntarily east to west across multiple states. We're an upstate New York tribe. We moved voluntarily to the state of Wisconsin and ended up on land that was given to us by the Menominee Tribe. And those of you who know your Native history know that the Menominee Tribe was one of the tribes terminated by the federal government. They became our neighbors. They are our brothers, and they were fortunately reinstated. But that's an interesting kind of dynamic that popped up today in the course of this conversation. We're all island communities. To the extent that we are not appended to an urban environment, we are islands. Our reservations are like the islands out in the Pacific. If the water rises on those islands, those people get in their boats and they move. If pain and difficult situations arise around our reservations, our people don't move. Those are their homelands. That's where they live. That's where they remain. And that has to be something that is taken into account when you start talking about housing in general, because people moving up in terms of housing, taking the value of your house out and moving into a bigger or a better property, there's a limitation to that when you are on an island. In terms of situations where we are similar, construction is one of the areas that benefits all of our societies. I look at both jobs and I look at and businesses. The jobs in the terms of looking back in history to the steelworkers, the Iroquois nation people who helped to build the island of Manhattan and all of its buildings. When I talk about businesses, I look to somebody like Linda Alvarado in Colorado, Denver, Colorado. Linda Alvarado started out with a hammer and a pickup truck and is the co-owner of the Colorado Rockies. We are homeless. I'm out of time. We are homeless, but not without a home. In our communities, our homeless people, our people who lose their homes, they come home. They come back to their families, and their families take them in. And so when we look at data points of homelessness, we have difficulty figuring out, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for our communities? Can you count homelessness? Or do you count people who don't have a home of their own? And the last thing I wanted to talk about was a data deficit. Native people are what we call the asterisk people. We, as you can see on a lot of the charts, there are not Native numbers included, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that there are not Native numbers reported. Sometimes they're collected, sometimes they're not. Sometimes there are insufficient numbers collected for the collectors to report on them, so they put a little asterisk there. And so we've become the asterisk people. And one of the things that would very much help the policy situation that I am in is to have our educators and have our researchers and our economists put together information that actually helps us, that looks at the last 5 or 10 years instead of the last 100 years, and looks at where policy money has gone and policy has gone in Indian country, and comes back to report back to us on how that money was better spent and how it was poorly spent, what worked and what didn't work. In a recent conference that I was in that was a series of a lot of economists reporting, there was one couple that got up and they had done this great study and reported out the study, and they were reporting on 2 data points from the early 1900s. And they only had 2 data points. And I recommended highly that they move their research into the 21st century and look at as many data points as possible, which are not that many for us, but are more than 2. Thank you.
So thank you so much. I am honored to be in your company, and I'm going to try to be as expeditious as I possibly can. I have a lot of information to share with you. Not a lot of solutions, a lot of questions, ideas to try to incite conversation and brainstorming among us. My name is Araceli Panameño. I'm with the Center for Responsible Lending, the Director of Latino Affairs there. Thank you, Anne, for listening to all my rants. Before I move on to my few slides, I'd like to say that throughout this conversation, I have squirmed on my seat about the definition and the connotation that has been elucidated and brought to our minds regarding Latino communities in this country. I am of immigrant descent. I did cross the border 5 times. For those of you that didn't, 5 times. But the overwhelming majority of Latinos in the United States did not cross the border crossed them. And so, in that regard, I felt uncomfortable about a room full of highly educated mentors and role models that I look up to, who continue to repeat these misinformation about some of our people in this great nation of ours. Thank you. I'll move right along. So why we can't wait? So in my presentation, my outline is very briefly, the foreclosure crisis is not over. It continues. It has decimated many of our families, our communities, primarily Latino and African American communities across this country. And the future of housing finance is now, right? That's why we can't wait. I'll share with you just a couple of my slides that refer to the data from the organization that I work for, the Center for Responsible Lending. We've done the three latest research projects that we've done. I will touch on those, and I will leave the rest of my slides, which will be available to all of you. But I'd like to, soon after those 3 research reports, I'd like to then take my disclaimer and say that the rest of my comments are mine alone, my own opinions, and do not represent the views of CRL or any organization affiliated with CRL. So I'll start with some basics. 1,900 completed foreclosures every day, according to CoreLogic, as of August foreclosure report. And as my sister was talking about earlier, most foreclosures in the states where Latinos and African Americans reside, and tremendous devastation. And there's that 47%. I'm part of that 47%. Worked to elect a president, and I have yet to receive whatever that gift is. It may be lost in the mail. I don't know. Here's the first report from CRL. 2 slides on this. The lost ground report that CRL released at the end of the year last year, which basically talked about this particular cohort of mortgages that had been originated, in the percentage of which has gone into foreclosure, and what that means for various communities, whether it is by income or by race, ethnicity. This might be a slide that you all may be more familiar with, and I'll just point to the 2 bars in the middle. 25% of African Americans and Latinos have or will lose their homes as a result of this foreclosure crisis. I will say that that is by proportion, right? So we are always affected by disproportionality and disparate impact. Certainly in raw numbers, the greatest number of foreclosures is among white Americans. But we have been sort of like at the receiving end and affected by LIFO, last in, first out. This is another research report that we released earlier this year, balancing risk and access, because the conversation had already began. There was a White House proposal, white paper, that was submitted regarding what Janice referred to in her opening comments about how do we unwind the GSEs and the role of FHA in housing finance. And I would disagree with that statement. I'd say we are in a different era, and we don't have to do that. We can reform. We can do positive reform, but I'll get into that later. Basically, what the slide says that if you have a down payment requirement of any particular amount, as you can see it there, there is a disparate impact and even, whites, right, at the 20% down payment requirement, 60% of whites would be disqualified for a mortgage loan. Now, this was based on a study of 20 million mortgages that were originated during the housing boom that by February of this year were still performing, so they had not entered into foreclosure. And so therefore, we believe that the criteria that was utilized to originate those mortgages, and mind you what the underwriting standards were at that time, right? We were not talking about 20, 10, or 5% down payments. FHA had a 3% down payment requirement. And I'm sure that you can read the rest of it. DTI and FICO scores requirements, which are part of the conversation as well for qualified mortgage and qualified residential mortgage rules. In the disparate impact, I thought I had 5 minutes.
That's been sitting there since you came.
Great suggestion. I agree with Manuel. We need to do something about this time limitations. And then finally, I'll just take the privilege of being at the mic here. The last paper, right, collateral damage, which basically we just released it several weeks ago. And homeowners near foreclosed properties, right? These are not the foreclosed families, but the homeowners near foreclosed properties have lost or will lose nearly $2 trillion in equity, right? And one of those $1 trillion is to us, to Latinos and African Americans, which speaks to the concentration of bad mortgages, segregated communities, et cetera, in the average loss. So that is CRL, and I will get into recommendations and thoughts and ideas for housing finance moving forward during the Q&A. Thank you.
Very little, in fact, I'd say no political appetite to do anything more than what's been done to address the foreclosure crisis. We can certainly tackle that issue more in the Q&A, but that's a problem because as you can see from the conversations that we've had up here, our families are suffering the most in terms of debt overhang, in terms of being in hard areas of having lost wealth that should have been propelling them forward. And now we're about to move into a time where we are in a time where interest rates are low and families should be buying and purchasing homes, but credit is, one, very tight, and two, the policy conversation around what that market looks like going forward, the way it's going now doesn't look like it will be very accessible or affordable to our folks. And that's really the policy challenge that we have. We're fortunate that we've got two other folks with us who have been great partners in thinking through kind of our mortgage infrastructure and the architecture of that market. And I want to ask them to respond to some of the things that they've heard today, not simply because we want some gender diversity, but because they've got good ideas too. Okay. So Jim Carr, who I think we all know is an expert in this area, has done a lot of great thinking, and also Victor Galloway, I'd love to ask you to contribute some thoughts as well. Both Jim and Victor have been working closely with them and with a coalition of civil rights organizations and allies, really thinking through these challenges.
Okay, thanks, Janice. Jim Carr, Opportunity Agenda. Everything I say that sounds brilliant, those are my views. Everything that sounds wrong or off track, you misunderstood. That's my qualifier. So let me just start off with a few things that Janice, you said at the beginning. I just want to reiterate because I think we can't say it enough. And that is the foreclosure crisis continues. And one of the problems that we have is that there is increasingly good news in the housing market about number of originations, house prices stabilizing, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact of the matter is the housing market is in complete disarray. And so the more we get these sort of micro data coming out, the less focus there is on fix the problem, and the problem really deserves fixing, particularly as it respects communities of color. One of the things that Janice said, I just want to reiterate again, this language around responsible homeowners, if there was one thing that we could just purge, that it would just be that language. Because every time that language is used, responsible, it reinforces the conservative narrative that said the housing crisis was really a failed government attempt to expand home ownership. And yet CRL's own data shows that in the 10 years leading up to the foreclosure crisis, less than 10% of the subprime loans that were originated were for first-time home ownership. So it wasn't about home ownership, and over half was refi. So this was financial exploitation, probably the greatest in American history, resulting in the greatest loss of wealth in American history. And then a couple of other things is this incredible debate and discussion around the role of home ownership going forward, and maybe we should be a renter society. And I have to say, every time I hear an economist say that, I'm now taken to asking, are you a homeowner? Because they always sort of smile and say, well, yes, and you don't need to explain it. Because really what you're saying is, it works for me, but you people, those other people who haven't gotten home ownership, we should rethink your becoming a homeowner. In fact, I now say it on panels in advance. If I know that's what's coming, I say, now, you'll notice the people who will say that, and then it doesn't happen. So I think preventative cure works really well. And then last thing, I thought, Janice, you made a really powerful point about there's just a lack of focus on what is the future of the homeownership market if people of color aren't able to access it. We used to say within the next 35, 36, 37 years, America will be a majority people of color. But the data now says that the majority of babies born in America are children of color. So we don't need to think 3 decades from now. We need to think right now, what are we doing to build their assets? But also remember that those are the people who, in fact, will need to be part of that market to buy those homes, or else home prices aren't going anywhere for anyone. In terms of the condition of the housing market, let me give you a few stats, some that were touched upon, some that weren't. So right now, when I say the housing market isn't out of the woods yet, we have between $700 billion and $1.1 trillion, depending on whose numbers you're looking at, on upside-down mortgage debt. We have house prices that still remain 30% below their highs, even though they've begun to stabilize in a lot of markets. In some markets, they remain more than 50% below their highs. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 million vacant and abandoned properties littering communities across the country, 3.4 million households that are seriously delinquent. And we have somewhere around a little over 20% of borrowers, but I think one of the slides that was shown, I think it was yours, Angelique, that said that for people under 40, it's over 45%. And what that means is, well, it's hard to say, well, is that good or bad? Should it be older people who are going into retirement who therefore have no way to leverage their properties for decent retirement? Or is it better that it's young people who now have lost their wealth and are struggling in debt going forward? That's the future of America versus its elderly. Which one is better? I'd say it's hard to say, right? Neither is better. Both are bad, and they both need to be fixed. So one of the points I'd like to make in terms of what's the future of the housing market at a very big level is, my point is that, or my position is, the housing market of the future is not the housing market of the past. And so when people are talking about the future of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and FHA, mostly what you hear them talking about is tightening up underwriting criteria and fixing the risk assessment structures, et cetera, so that we have a much more, we have the same system we had before, less subject to losses. But we have 3 conditions that exist right now that I think the new housing finance system must address. And I think we need bold thinking and bold actions, just as we had coming out of the Great Recession, Great Depression, which is what created the Federal Home Loan Banks, FHA, and Fannie Mae in the first place. And those 3 conditions are the following. The foreclosure crisis is not over. Did I say that already? So we need an agency that actually takes foreclosure mitigation seriously and really begins to mitigate it, because there are over and over, so I can give you a whole laundry list of things that aren't being done right now in which households could maintain their homes. The second is that we have the lowest house prices in more than a decade. We have the lowest interest rates in history. And on top of that, we have distressed properties as well as vacant and abandoned. And who are we making those extraordinary investment opportunities available for? Investors. And in many cases, the same investors who brought us the foreclosure crisis in the first place. So they gave us the crisis that fell apart. Now federal agencies are taking the lead and helping to make sure those investors get to start the process all over. And we're already beginning to hear about flipping again. Of course, because house prices are starting to rise. So we need a housing finance system that leverages those opportunities for low and moderate income, for middle class, and for people of color. And the third thing is we need to rebuild communities, because communities have been decimated, particularly communities of color. And so one of the things I think we need is a housing finance system that funds housing, new and rehab, rental and owner, and community infrastructure. And so one of the things I've done recently is write an article about the need for a housing and community infrastructure bank. I think nothing short of something really revolutionary like that will do to address the problems that we need, and I can comment more on them in Q&A. I just want to make one comment on the issue, Leslie's issue about tribal lands. I think that presentation is so powerful and so important because it shows the great diversity there is between us in this room, between people of color. And when you start looking at tribal lands, it's like you have to scratch your head and say, well, is there anything that can be done? Because, you know, what's unique to that land? If it doesn't have oil, if it doesn't have gold, if it doesn't have diamonds in it, well, what do you do with it? And you said, Leslie, you can't move. Well, you can't move away, but maybe you can move something there. And so, for example, I don't think that we, as a community of color, should forget tribal lands and the fact that you could locate things there. So I'll just throw this out because I thought about it while you were talking. Feel free to dismiss it, but don't do it in front of me and embarrass me in front of all my colleagues. But what if we've been talking about education all day, and I was just thinking, well, what if the U.S. launched a whole new system of universities focused on STEM education, science, technology, engineering? These would be rocket science universities or colleges that are specifically tailored at bringing kids right out of college and really making them engineers. But it would have all sorts of mentoring programs and things of that nature, maybe to get kids who hadn't really thought about science, math, technology. Maybe they're not at the top of their classes, but when they graduate, they are super at the top of their classes, and they're located on native lands only. And they're, you know, so the only reason I put it out there is to say just because the land itself doesn't have unique value or resources doesn't mean we as a coalition can't help you get the federal government to do something special in and around those lands that make them much more valuable than they are now and use that as an economic generator. So I would just encourage all of us to think about the unique challenges that you face and not just assume that because the resources aren't there, we can't create something really innovative.
Thank you all for this opportunity. Real quick points. First, with the MBEs, for those who don't know, my name is Victor Galloway with North Carolina Institute. I think we sometimes miss the connection between economic development and job creation as it relates to housing. We know that over 80% of the equity that is housed, most small businesses use that to either leverage their small business or sustain their small business. And they use their home probably in their personal taxes more than a business tax. We also know that, as the chart showed by from the Federal Reserve, was that there was an increase because being displaced because of foreclosure or even because of loss of job, the next source for rebound is creating your own job, becoming an entrepreneur. What's not been talked in the conversation, not kind of going opposite end with Jim went, was that those folks who have gone through the foreclosure process, I mean, what has been done to get them back in the credit market? And to get back in the credit market means more than just housing. It means jobs. It means the rate you pay for insurance and other financial services, and even now, even going education because you can't finance loans to get your kids into college. So it leads me to this thing what I coin as a circle of disparity. If you put housing at the top, from that we know that safe house, healthy homes breed healthy families, which helps perpetuate better education. But we talked affordable access to capital and credit kind of dampens that. Then you go from that to health disparities. If you don't have access to affordable capital and credit. You can't afford housing. You can't afford education, and then you're more stressed because you're at the bottom tier. So you don't eat right, you don't live right, and then you got health disparity. And then the circle disparity continues. But also, with the regulatory point, we're talking about housing with foreclosure, is that there's still some challenges with our regulatory and agency friends about really disconnecting or having conflict of interest when you have some of our banking partners on your boards self-regulating themselves. Still have some work to do there. And then also our servicers who are supposed to help purge some of the due diligence in securing some of our foreclosure issue are still going for profit foreclosure than working out loss mitigation for the borrowers. So it's crazy stuff. And then what is also hidden is what Michael works on with investment partners is banks not foreclosing on properties they should foreclose on. So the borrowers have been kicked out. The city can't do anything because there has not been a legal execution of foreclosure. And so vacant properties arise. And the properties that get the least amount of attention happen to be located in the most, in our neighborhoods or low wealth communities. And so again, it creates this other cycle. So in the last, I would say, as impact of housing, when you look at it from a policy standpoint, it's bankruptcy issue. You can include your second and third and fourth home in bankruptcy, but you can't include your primary home, which is crazy. So one of the things as looking at this housing crisis is that, as Jim mentioned, there are things we can do going forward, but also some systematic and systemic things we need to address now that is really fixable by really just doing what is already on the books, by enforcing, and then putting folks who are already been put to the fire to just really, I always say you got to pick out a villain, and everybody needs to go after that one villain. And that's my advocacy hat on, but at the same time, we just need to be aware that housing touches everything in our communities, and we cannot have economic recovery unless we address the systemic problem with housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. So let's open it up for some questions. I know there's probably a lot, so I see one and then two over here. Sorry, I don't know everybody's name, so I'm pointing, but please introduce yourself.
I'm Catherine Giscombe, and I have a question about just the kind of core value of housing within minority communities. And I know that studies of black communities have shown that typically when the percentage of black residents gets over a certain point, say over 20% or 30%, whites stop buying in that neighborhood, and eventually it becomes predominantly African American. And what happens in terms of, for example, parents wanting to pass wealth on to their children is that the value of the home declines, so that there's really nothing to pass on in terms of that major asset. And it's such a systemic problem. I know this is yet another complication to what's going on right now, but I guess especially for Angelique Campbell, I wondered if there were any kinds of policies that could exist or be created to deal with this ongoing problem of the continual loss of value in homes in certain minority communities.
So I think the problem that I've seen is really property, real estate is such a local issue. And to try and to develop a national strategy for how you value, for property valuation and the like is just very challenging. And I think this is why we are so perplexed on coming up with certain solutions that can stick. Because the property conditions, the market values, just the whole just the economic recovery in certain areas is just so uneven. So I hear your question, but I think what I'm getting at is a larger problem, which is it's just difficult at a federal level to be able to have this broad brush approach on how you do. I know Jim is just really waiting to get into this. I know he is. And I know that he is going to propose something that's very radical, and my heart agrees. But this is something that I think the advocacy community really does need to know. Who are you directing this conversation to? Because you want to make sure that it is the right policy decision maker at the level that can really affect certain change. And again, those types of property issues I am seeing is really best handled at the local level. The federal can can affect other areas.
I can speak to that as well. Not in every neighborhood, but certainly one of the things that's at play there is an issue around redlining, segregation, and discrimination in our housing markets. And it is a local issue, and we have a problem with our realtors and with our local infrastructure that allows that to go on. And there are certain best practices that can help evade that. There's examples of more integrated towns that have proactively sought ways to kind of to maintain a balance. But one of the things that can be done from a policy perspective at the federal level is that right now the administration is sitting on their regs for affirmatively furthering fair housing. And it is, the Fair Housing Act requires everybody who gets federal money to affirmatively further fair housing. Those local CDBG dollars have to not only be used in a way that does no harm, they have to actually proactively dismantle segregation. And in fact, that rarely, if ever, happens. And there was a case that got a lot of notice. A lot of people in this room, I'm sure, are familiar with the Westchester case. We've been waiting now for HUD to put out the regs that will actually tell cities how to implement that rule. It's on the books, it's the Fair Housing Act, it's been there for a long time, but cities and counties haven't actually had any kind of guidance that tells them how they can do that and what that implementation looks like. It's not going to change the problem overnight, but it could help get to more proactively creating strong integrated communities. Let's go over here, and then I'm going to let Jim quickly. I want to make sure we spread the mic around.
Good afternoon. My name is Basil Gooden. I'm a Chief Deputy Director of the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development. And I want to thank the panel for such a rich discussion of these ideas today. One of the issues that I run into and my agency runs into tremendously, and I've been there about 12 years, is not only the loss of wealth through foreclosure, but the loss of wealth and property through heir property issues, where you have so many family members that are on a deed or that are entitled to a portion of the property, where that wealth is lost, whether it's through a tax lien, or you can't even avail yourself to a governmental program such as what my agency does. For example, one of the first field trips that I went on 12 years ago was an elderly lady in Caroline County, Virginia. She lived in a tar paper shack. Her floor was a dirt floor. Walking in the house, she had a hole in the ceiling, she had a tar paper. And she said that she used to have rats in her house until the snakes moved in. Now, we weren't able, and in addition, she was raising 3 grandkids. Now, can you imagine, and these kids were in grade school, and can you imagine the impact that it would have if you lived in that type of condition, on your ability to do your homework, if you had to worry about snakes under your couch and things like that. But we weren't able to help this lady because we couldn't clear a deed, the title. She had family members that said, well, if I can't benefit, I'm not signing this over to you. So I was just wondering, did you all have any suggestions on how we could address some of the attitudes and I guess increase the education in some of the communities to sort of, reduce this heir property issue where you can't even, help through either governmental programs or just a loss of wealth because, of this heir property issue. So I didn't know if the panel had any suggestions or recommendations on that.
So I'll tell you a story first. Several years ago, I live in Prince William County, Virginia. And several years ago, the city of Manassas moved to try to do a definition of family for the purpose of immigration-related issues, and landlords were put in a position to try to enforce immigration policy. But it was related to housing and housing conditions, and some of the complaints were that Latino homeowners in the city of Manassas, particularly historic Manassas, there were just too many men living in the house. There were just too many vehicles in the parking area or on the street in front of that property. People lived in fear. They would not walk their dogs, etc. They also, because they were property owners, They also would turn garages into extra bedrooms that weren't necessarily meeting housing code. And so we had a big fight there. One of the recommendations, this led to elections, fights on the street. If you have not seen it, Liberty 9500, a video available on the web, would give you a little bit of an insight into the intersection between immigration policy and housing in Virginia. Coming back to the housing-related point, after elections, a member of the County Board of Supervisors proposed that one of the things that we needed to do was not only educate members of our local government as well as members of the community, in that we needed to hire culturally competent inspectors that could work with the community and before you sort of like kicked out people or tried to take property back, that you could educate community as well as members of government. And needless to say, the majority of the decision makers within the County Board of Supervisors had a policy position of anti-immigrant, anti-Latino, anti-African American communities, and so the decision was in the negative. And the fight has continued, and there is that intersection. But if there's a recommendation that you could potentially move, is precisely hiring staff at the local level and within the agency that serves that mediation in educational gap prior to enforcing liens on properties.
One of the situations on Indian land is very similar to this in that we have, through inheritance resulting from a federal government policy many years ago, plots of land that have hundreds and sometimes thousands of owners, and where the land has been divided into such small pieces that it's become unusable for almost anything. One of the ways that we're looking at that as a policy is to try to find a way to push financing down into the community available to people who are on or want to buy what's called fractionated lands, so that there's a value there to the other people in participating in consolidating or reconsolidating those parcels of land. Typically they're family members, and typically in our case it's not always easy to get them to see eye to eye. But the financing helps, and what we've actually been working with the Farm Bill on through is pushing that funding through the local CDFIs, so that not only do you have financing coming down and benefiting a local community business, but you also have the output of that from the revenues that the CDFIs make in Indian country. They take that and push it into financial literacy programs. So you've got a kind of a multiple benefit thing going on there if we can get this Congress to approve the Farm Bill.
So I just want to make one real quick point, because I wanted to impress Angelique that I actually had something practical to say as opposed to theoretical. I didn't want to let this go. But the situation you're talking about is standard old-fashioned steering. And I think it's really important to understand that, because that gap in the prices of homes has actually been measured and been quantified as the unexplainable 20% called the segregation tax. And it is as much a reflection of steering on the part of the real estate agents as it is on the consumption purchase desires of white homeowners. And I think that's really important, because the National Fair Housing Alliance every year documents how white households want to move to these neighborhoods that we say they don't want to. They don't, because the real estate agents say the schools are bad, it's a crime-ridden neighborhood, it's not the place you want to go, even in cases where, in fact, the people of color who live in those neighborhoods are higher income and higher education than the white borrowers. So perpetuating that system through the real estate agents is really important. And the only reason I wanted to make this point is if we simply significantly ratchet up testing, just, that blind testing, so that you don't know what's going on, and we're active in every market for, $10 million, $20 million worth of additional investment, we could probably be creating over $100 million, $200 million worth of wealth. And so it's a really, really great opportunity for us to enforce the law in that case, and it's something that we don't do, and it doesn't require any new institutions or anything else, just fun, purging discrimination.
Just to piggyback on what Jim said, is one thing that you can do on your local level is that it needs to be more accountability and licensing requirement for appraisers, because if you look at an appraiser deeply, the comments that they put in there, they have no merit. It's just their opinion, but it used as the gospel. And I look at comparison that when you have tax assessment, do two things. If a new construction is the cost that you went out, bought your materials, and what the bank said it was worth at that time. That's the equalizer. As soon as the real estate sign goes up, an appraiser put those little words about extra percentage lives in this neighborhood, all that, then you get that discriminatory factor. And I think if we go back and look at when someone who's offering their opinion but has no responsibility, accountability for it, you always would have this redlining. So as with the real estate contract, they can't offer legal advice. I think for an appraiser, if they're going to offer the advice of the impact of minorities living in a neighborhood, values or devalues a house needs to be raised from a policy standpoint. That can be done through licensing, because it is false.
Michael with Reinvestment Partners in Durham, North Carolina. I wanted to make 2 points about kind of the role of the future of home ownership. And the first talks about still the access to home ownership, not from an access to credit standpoint, but from a discrimination standpoint that still exists from the loan origination side. And Jim mentioned testing and the need for continued testing. We've done a project this year between July and November where we did 80 paired tests of 5 different banking institutions between North and South Carolina that looked at differential treatment from a loan origination standpoint. And surprisingly, what we found is that it's not the loan officers that do the discrimination, but what happens is the front-end staff. So when the customers walk into the branch, there's a differential treatment happening between white testers and protected class testers. And so if home ownership is going to continue to be a part of the solution to addressing racial wealth gap, we need to find solutions to continue to hold banks accountable for how they train their staff about differential treatment. Because if the person walking into the branch is discouraged before they even get to a loan officer, what's the likelihood of them going to a different branch or coming back to that same branch to try to attain home ownership? And so we're still compiling all the data from the test, and we'll have a report out early next year about it. But what we have found is, even with talking to some of the banks that we took their testing results to, was one, they're surprised that we didn't test loan officers and tested front-end staff, and two, that they had to admit that they had a lack of training for those people at the front end, not recognizing that the front-end people are the gateway to the bank. So it's not just, it's more than just home ownership, but also just adequate banking services. If a protected class person walks into a branch and is discouraged, then it's not just home ownership that they could be missing out on, but it's also banking services. And the second point is still about bank accountability, but now that we have the AG settlement and people are happy about it to a certain extent, is that it can't stop there. Now we still have to hold banks accountable, because within the AG settlement there are some provisions about community blight and addressing bank walkaways or properties that banks choose to not foreclose on because there's not enough profit in it for them. And what's happened is these properties, as Victor and Jim had talked about, are located in communities of color, and these impact the housing stock, both what's available for purchase for affordable home ownership or even for rental housing, which can uplift our communities. But because they're boarded up and vacant, they are hurting property values of the homeowners who are in those communities. And if we don't continue to ensure that there is a proper enforcement of the AG settlement, then we're still going to have a continued problem with wealth stripping through property values diminishing and these homes that just sit there without being able to be used to uplift communities.
Okay. So Araceli, let's start here, 2-3 minutes lightning round. Let's to wrap us up. Final thoughts.
So for communities of color, wealth building is made possible. We already know we don't have assets in the bank. We haven't gotten inheritance, passed along, so it's made possible through income. And so terms of credit matter, right? Credit conditions matter. To further my point about the future of housing finances now, I wanted to share with you just very stark information about what it would take for an African American family to save 20% down payment if 20% was the required. It would take an average African American family more than 55 years to save a 20% down payment on an average price home today, right? It would take them more than 30 years to save 10%, and it would take them nearly 20 years to save 5%. Latinos are close to those number of years as well. So credit conditions in the terms of credit matter. One idea that I'd like to pose as we consider moving forward, we are in the Geithner is out era. We don't have to in potentially DeMarco. And while we can celebrate, that doesn't change policy. So we need to really strategize. We have an agency, the CFPB, that has been created to help us defend and protect the rights of consumers. I would suggest that one idea that I have not yet heard and that I would like to put on the table is that the CFPB develop something akin to a clinical trials process for mortgage products, and that they be tested and piloted with a right to call back, et cetera. Plenty other ideas, but in the interest of time, I'm passing.
I continue the beta testing idea. I really like it because I think that one of the areas that we need to focus on is how to repackage, reassess risk and underwriting standards. And I don't know how we do that. I just know that it makes it very hard on people who have either gone through the process or who are trying to build up to get to an application point when that mark keeps going up and up and up. They don't have the down payment, or they don't have the credit worthiness, or they don't have what it takes because those lines, those what they need to get their first mortgage or their next mortgage keeps going up as our people who are working in these banking sectors look at what they have and they look at risk and they say, well, we don't want to take on so much risk anymore. Our underwriters won't accept so much risk anymore. And I think somehow we have to refocus that mindset, especially if we have a housing market that's out there, if we have building structures out there and we have people who want them, we have people who want people in them. That's the other point there. I don't know how to do a community gathering that would actually look at those housing stocks that are in our communities and figure out a way for the community to acquire those places, fix them up, and get them back on the market to members who want to join that community. I don't know if that's a local church. I don't know if it's a local nonprofit, but there have to be some kinds of entities that either are already out there or can be created that have the wherewithal to come in and pick up those properties, take them off the market, get them fixed up, and get them back into productive use. Thank you.
I will respond quickly to the bank walkaway. That is an issue. We've seen it in, particularly in low wealth communities. The Federal Reserve now has guidance out on that. So feel free to talk to me afterwards. But yes, I agree with you, that is an issue. The other, I just want to wrap and just say another thing that has been exposed out of this crisis is all of the mismatches and the misalignment of incentives. And that's a problem going forward that does need to be addressed, and that surely is a federal issue. So I think there's going to be a lot more conversation going forward about the regulated entities working on behalf of a stronger system for borrowers that are safe, that's safe and sound, not just a profit maximizing system. The other thing is, and this is really important because we are discussing policies about qualified mortgage and qualified risk retention policies and the like for QRM. And that is just the whole conversation about down payment and the significance of that. I encourage you, if you have research, If you have something along the line of what UNC Center for Community Capital has been discussing in terms of the amount of the low down payment, I think it was 3% for the loans that they were studying, the vintage loans, that performed very well. I think it's important right now for those conversations to start emerging and for you to start flooding the regulatory agencies with this talk, because the counter narrative is not getting exposed. It is not coming forward. So if you call me or Barbara Robles is my colleague, we definitely will create the invitation for you to come and discuss that kind of research. And then my last point, going forward, I can't underscore this enough. This is a very evolving financial marketplace. It will only get more complicated. So even with all of our discussions about a qualified mortgage and how that might return us to a vanilla 30-year fixed, you better believe that there are other products out there that are just as complicated, and it is only getting worse. So at this point, there has to be some discussion about counseling. And I will say, according to some research that's coming out, borrowers do not respond to the term of counseling. They feel like that means that there's something wrong with them. We got to come up with another term, because we need to reach the borrowers who need to have somebody at the table to be their advocate and walk them through this maze. Thank you.
As somebody in the housing counseling space, we use advising and coaching a lot, which I think people respond to. So let me just wrap up. As I've been listening to the conversation over the last day and a half, we've had a very powerful theme throughout all of the talks of telling stories and lifting up personal narratives. And so I wanted to close with a story of a family who had been through foreclosure. A couple of years ago, I did a paper with Roberto Garcia, many of you know, at UNC Chapel Hill, looking at the impact of foreclosure on children and Latino children and families. And this is one story. I've repeated this story a number of times. It's stuck with me. It's one of those that sort of haunts me. And as this morning's talk, one of the things that I thought was really great is we were lifting up that survival instinct that's so embedded in our communities and how resilient our communities are. And because the housing situation sounds like it's really bad right now, I thought I would lift up a sort of an example of somebody who inspires me and is very resilient. So Mr. Nogales, he continues to live in rural North Georgia. He has a young son who is 5 years old, and at the time of the interview, his wife was pregnant. He had lost his job. She was their sole earner. When she got pregnant, she lost her job. I'm queuing up the next panel, who I know is going to talk about low-wage workers and worker fairness issues. So I won't even go into that. But when her employer found out she was pregnant, she lost her job. He found temporary work as a truck driver. It kept him very far from his family, still couldn't meet the bills. Wife tried to go back to work. This house, I don't remember the exact dollar amount, but it's rural North Georgia. We're talking about a house that they had put a down payment on of being, $60,000 or so, and they couldn't get the bank to negotiate with them to help them save that house. They ultimately lost it in foreclosure, and this is what he said. This is translated. The interview was in Spanish. This is the English translation. He says, "I am the type of person that could fall and fail, but I will not stay like this. I know that sooner or later an opportunity will come up. I believe this has affected me a lot, but that doesn't mean I'm going to stay where this situation has me. I have to find a way. I'm exploring maybe selling water or something. I'm that kind of person. I like to work hard for my things, and I have no problem with that. I don't like to depend on other people in order to get what I want." Not only is there this resilience, but again, working against the stereotypes that, that somehow people that are in foreclosure are there because they were irresponsible, or that somehow our communities are not working hard for the things that they deserve. In fact, our families are working hard. As an advocate, this is the kind of thing that drives me, is to make sure that this kind of family still has a shot to come back into the housing market. There's plenty of real economists here. I'm a fake one, but I'll tell you that it's also in our economic interest to make sure, as the points have been made, that families that have been passed over, whether it's because they got a subprime loan when they shouldn't have, and so they've gone through foreclosure through no fault of their own, or because they've been left out of our wealth-building policies over generations, that they get included this time around. We have a very unique opportunity with Dodd-Frank being in place to regulate the primary market and a rebuilding of the secondary market to reframe and recalibrate the flow of capital in our communities. I certainly look forward to working with all of you on that. Thank you.